I want to start my talk by saying I'd like to contextualize, and I think as the starting speaker, I want to sort of set a broad, if you like, tapestry of what can be discussed in climate change, and in particular share with you all where we're going in the science. I think often we think of scientists sitting in laboratories very isolated from the mainstream activities that are happening in the world, but I want to try and show you some of the cutting edges where I think we are making inputs into this messy world. And I've got as my golden thread, and I hope others are going to pick up on that, predicament, place, partners, and persuasion, the kind of 4 Ps. I don't know if any of you have often gone to church or not, but ministers also love having those characterizations. So the predicament. I'm not going to talk too long about this because, as already indicated, we are in a predicament. Africa, as you know, is already heating up at twice the global average. These are pictures that really show the consolidation of the science, bringing in multiple models. Obviously, the science is not perfectly certain, but we can start to get a global picture. And the big debate and the big issue is to try and keep us to 1.5 degrees, and even if we can go lower. But many are arguing that, in fact, we've already got overshoot. And you can see from these pictures that Africa is one of the most vulnerable continents, not least because of the configuration of the atmospheric systems that give rise to some of our droughts and our floods, but also because we're coming off quite a low base, not because we don't have capacity and the will to do the change, but in fact because years of legacies of various things that have happened in Africa, including poverty and various structural causes. But I don't have long time to go into those. But bear in mind that legacy context is very important as we think about hopefully not going around the same mountain and making the same mistakes that we've done in the past. But the warming of the atmosphere also means that as the atmosphere warms up, it can hold more water. And so it's not surprising that, in fact, many of our areas in South Africa, Southern Africa, are going to be becoming drier and also highly at risk to droughts. We've already seen what happened in Cape Town, although the configuration of what drove that drought crisis is not only climate change. And that's a take-home message I'd like to leave with you, that we need to be thinking of this more in its context and its deeper sense. But you can see from the slide that Southern Africa is projected to become systematically drier and drastically warmer. This is all laid on top of the constraints that we already have with an energy crisis. In particular, what will that mean as we concatenate down the road for water and food security? And I know we're going to talk about some of those elements just now. I can't, as I say, go into a lot of detail, but there are issues about shifting paradigms, which I'll come back to later in my presentation. Of most concern, though, is this worry that we are going to have these concatenating risks, droughts followed by floods, followed by heat waves, etc., etc. And just as soon as you think you've got your head around multi-year droughts, another catastrophe comes. And we've had years of these things happening in terms of variability, even without the face of climate change. And yet we've learned quite a little. I would argue that, in fact, our institutions are not configured for what is coming down the track, and I can talk about that at a later stage if needed. But we also have the winter and summer rainfall variation differences, and if you magnify that across Africa, what is that going to mean in terms of trade, in terms of political negotiations? We're seeing that already with our energy crisis. So it's a very complex and messy world. And our options of adaptation, which is the space that I work in, I'm not an energy analyst. I'll leave those to the experts who are the energy analysts. I work really in the space where the pawpaw hits the fan. What do we do when we've had current climate change? How can we ratchet that up? And how can we ensure that the science that we are doing is an engaged science? We've heard about the need for action, and that's really the interface where I work. You can see I do have a bit of pink in my hair. I regularly dye it because it's a very messy space, as I'll show you, working with various agencies who often are slow to engage. But place matters. It increasingly is important for us to contextualize this. We all see the COP, the big discussions happening on the global and the international stage, but it's really, I would argue, more and more and more coming down to the local place. How do we engage you and myself, other people sitting in Johannesburg and outside of this context, into this debate? So the necessities, and again, this is not really new stuff, but I just want to bring these people into the room because often they don't have the microphone, they don't have the voice. And how do you bring these people into the room? So we are doing quite a lot of science now, trying to look at resource utilization. We're currently doing huge assessments called IPBES. It's the Intergovernmental Panel on Policy, Biodiversity, Ecosystem Services. And we're really trying to look at what it means in terms of resource utilization for food, basic livelihoods. How do these people live just currently, and then what it will mean in the future? And obviously, we're also trying to stretch that discussion, as I'll show you in a minute. That's the rural context. We are aware of that. But it's the urban context which I think is glaringly in our face. We drive past these contexts all day. But do we actually even think of the climate change layering that comes on top of that? And the word we use in science is intersectionality. Where do these things come together? So how do our national development plans that we are putting on the table, are we even looking at that with a lens to climate change and to risks? Here's just a brief little picture, but it's often spoken about that we're going to have heat waves where things will warm up, as I've already shown you. But if you go inside, into those rooms, into those places, into the context, you actually come across places where people are living in temperatures of 45 degrees without even going outside. School children sitting in classrooms that are constructed from these very materials. What does that mean? So how do we get this gendered, detailed, all these kinds of aspects that we have to root down? So I've gone from quite broad, I'm now narrowing it down into some of these issues that are important. So the intersectionality of risks, I think, are laid bare outside. We can see the lack of services in many cases with our governments and what we are doing in African contexts. We can also see the behavioral characteristics of various people as they try and survive. What does it mean when you have a flood and you've got stormwater drains that are blocked for various reasons? How does that all intersect and make the crisis worse? Having done with the science, I now want to really talk about my passion, which is partners matter. I really think it's us sitting in this room who have to coalesce. We can't just be doing this on our own anymore. We need to find the coalitions of the willing. And one of the colleagues that I work with now overseas internationally has designed this quite nice heuristic, I think, but that ties together what I want to leave you with today. The science is fine. We know a lot. We're getting there. We're getting better science. It's really good science. We've been given prizes for that. But for me, science is not enough. With all due respect, I might not have a job tomorrow, but definitely science is not enough. We need to be doing the science on these elements to really make a difference. The practical, the technical, the political. What does that mean in terms of on the ground? But more importantly, it's this outer circle I'd like you to take away with you today, the personal. How do beliefs, values, and worldviews and paradigms configure how people are perceiving that problem? So often we come with a very first world, westernized, positivist way of looking at the problem. What about other cosmologies? People working on continents away from us, from Latin America, South America, where people perceive that differently. And then how do wisdom traditions, how do spirituality, how do issues of belief systems come into play into the space? And what I want to add is that many of us in the sciences are now moving right across into these paradigms, which are really interesting, and we need new partners, and I'm hoping many of you can come and help us do that. So as I try and draw some of this together, I would argue that we need three things in terms of our paradigm. The one is the hardware, the internal motivation. People are getting frustrated, they're getting desperate, they're starting to mobilize onto the streets. How do you touch that section of a person and their imaginings and not just only the head? So often we use the expression in the science circles that we as scientists need to get out of our way. We're very much in our way because we're constantly thinking as scientists, which is a good thing, but we also need to be starting to think about these other motivations. So for example, trying to get coalitions of the willing in terms of well-being economies, well-being communities, communities of care. How can we cluster? How can we start to do this and raise it up with a strong base to show that it has meaning and is not just kumbaya? Hardware technological solutions, I'm not going to go into. There are many of those, but that also raises a whole range of political issues of who's setting the rules for the game, where does AI intersect with all this, and more particularly, what are the ethics around some of these things that are coming into the conversation. And then finally in this picture, the software, the politics, The institutions, I've already mentioned that I'm very concerned about the design of institutions, formal institutions and informal. How can we look at those? I've been working for a long time with municipalities in trying to understand those alongside my colleagues in the country. Arts and social media I'll come back to as well. So it's really a mix of knowledges, and we in the scientists are now using this fancy word, although it's not really, I don't think, rocket science, but it really draws to the attention that we need this plural knowledge base, not just throwing our science over the wall outside the university and hoping partners will come, but actually having conversations like we're having today, where we start talking, walking a mile in each other's shoes and really identifying on this. So that's where I'm starting to push a lot of my science on the local context, the youth, and on community engagements, but really respectfully and humbly trying to listen and work on these contexts. And I want to bring my talk to an end by focusing. I've been working in this field for about 30 odd years. I really would like to mention a process that I was involved in that I think has been phenomenal. It's one of the things that I will die happy about in terms of my journey in climate change. And that was helping the youth in the city. I was working with the South African Institute of International Affairs, and at the same time was working with the city of Johannesburg with their division dealing with environmental issues. And during COVID, this group of young people from the ages of 18 to 35 met on Saturdays and in evenings and tried to begin to articulate their vision for a climate action plan, which had been instigated by the C40 community, which is the compact of mayors around the world and also in Africa. And they called it the YCAP. And what was really interesting in those debates is that the city started to see things through the eyes of the youth. Things like I've already spoken about, intersectionality, what is the type of systemic change that we might need, the just transition, innovation, and sustainability. And what was so awesome for the young people is they'd been constantly knocking at the door, trying to get into these spaces, but had never really been invited into the room. And through this process, we were enabled to get them to actually have a chapter in the actual climate change action plan. And also then they ratcheted up from that and did a South African youth climate action plan. And some of them were invited just recently to go to the COP as part of the official delegation. So it's the voices of those who are not in the room that I think we really need to be focusing on, and I'd love to hear how some of you are trying to do that. Obviously business is critical, etc., but it's often the other groups that tend to be left out. So finally, and I'm really grateful for having this chance to share, another area of work that I think we need to be spending quite a lot of time is on persuasion. Not everyone wants to be bashed over the head about climate change and have facts forced down their throats. How do we subtly and softly bring through those elements that I've been trying to share, the hardware, and the software, both in my science, where I need to be doing science to support this, but also in other disciplines and fields. And one of the privileges, I know some of you might know her in the room, is to have been working with a lady called Hanali Kutsia, who is an artist, and she walked me through the city, and just seeing the city through her eyes really shifted quite a lot of my perspectives. And she then started to do a master's with me, and we started to look at these conversations at the intersections and what the role of art can be to open the eco-imaginary, to actually widen it just from only looking at the technical and some of the software issues. And I'll just give one example. There are many I could have given, and I know there are artists who are going to step forward just now. But here is an example of what she was trying to do. So we were struggling in working with the city of Johannesburg, with the engineers who think specifically around how to put in infrastructure for stormwater drainage. She came up with an idea to have an eco seat, and what you do here is that the water is articulated, sent down into the ground, but it's also working with communities. They have a seat that they can use, etc., etc. So how can we bring these different types of imaginations, technologies, techniques together so that we can really think in terms of the future? In particular, things like different types of ecologies, reforestation processes, etc. So in conclusion, I would like to use the concluding document from the city of Johannesburg. They were invited in to give the forward, actually, and I just want to read this quickly. We are facing an emergency an urgency, severity, and scope never before experienced by humankind. So far, our response hasn't been anywhere close to adequate. But you already know that. You know it in your gut, in your bones. We are each part of the planet's living systems, knitted together with almost 7.7 billion human beings and 1.8 million known species. We can feel the connections between us. We can feel the brokenness and the closing window to heal it. This Earth, our home, is telling us that a better way of being must emerge, and fast. The science is clear. According to the IPCC, we need to limit the rise to 1.5 by 2030. We are already experiencing the effects of climate change with vulnerable communities, which I've tried to share with you some of those aspects of the science we are doing. But the time to act, they argue, is now, but as we've heard earlier, was yesterday. Thank you very much.